Good afternoon, my lord. I didn't see you there. You sneaked up on me.
Not at all. Good afternoon, Miss Van Weishuizen. Now, you have another witness for us this afternoon, please?
I do, my lord. We've got Dr. Wood with us, who is co-founder of A Place in Childhood.
Very good. Good afternoon, Dr. Wood.
Good afternoon.
Thank you for coming. Now, when you're ready, Miss Van Weishuizen.
Thank you, my lord. Dr. Wood, would you mind giving your full names, please?
Yes, my name is Dr. Jenny Wood.
And you have given a witness statement to the inquiry, is that correct?
Yes, I have.
My lord, for reference, that's WT0571. Dr. Wood, you're co-founder of something called A Place in Childhood, is that correct?
Yes, it is.
Could you please, you've obviously got a doctorate, could you please explain your academic background?
Yes, so I have a PhD in children's rights in the Scottish town planning system, which I gained in 2016.
And you are co-founder of A Place in Childhood. What is, or APIC as I think it's known
Yes.
short, what is APIC and how did you come to co-found it?
So we're a social enterprise that works with children and young people, and our main aim is to enable children and young people to have a say in the things that matter to them, and particularly to be able to make changes in their communities. Often children and young people aren't listened to, so that's something that we really wanted to make happen. So that was based on my PhD research and also the PhD research of some of our other co-founders, and we really want to look at practical action to bring children and young people into the discussions around the places that they live and how the environments affect them, because this is often a bit of a blind spot for policymakers, and in research there's lots of evidence, but it's not necessarily used.
And I'll come to ask you to talk about some of the projects that APIC undertook during the pandemic. But could I ask you to please outline what APIC did pre-pandemic?
So we've done a range of different projects prior to the pandemic. Most of our projects are around rights-based research with children and young people or participatory work. So a few projects that we did before the pandemic would include supporting Scottish Government and Play Scotland to co-create new versions of what they call the Play Standard tools for children and young people. And we've also done various research projects and bits of work with organisations like Play Scotland and Trans Scotland to get children and young people's voices around play and getting outside and using their environments.
In paragraph 12 and 13, you summarise what you did during the pandemic. We'll come on to talk shortly about the hashtag Youth Scotland COVID series. But you say, I think in paragraph 13, that an important project you did was related to play pedagogy, and you co-produced the Play Pedagogy Award, and I think that was with Play Scotland, who we've heard from this week. Could you please explain a bit more about that, what that project involved?
Yeah, so that project was around improving the experience for primary age children in Scotland. So Play Scotland is really interested in how play can be used to further that, and that's also something of deep interest to us as well. So we supported them to create a toolkit for playful learning in schools, and then we worked with them to co-create what an award could look like in Scottish primary schools. So we did that with a range of teachers from around the country, and we convened a range of online workshops to talk about what that should look like, so kind of mapping their journeys from not having done any play pedagogy to kind of being experts in play pedagogy. Some were right at the start of their journey, and some were kind of, they'd done a lot of work really off their own back. And it was about how can we create an award that is really motivating for schools and teachers to take part in to improve the experience for their children, and what do all of those steps need to look like. So educators are the real experts in how this works within the school environment, so we wanted to co-create it with them so that we knew that it would work for them, and also we didn't want it to just be for early years, which is often where play is focused. We wanted it to be something that could work throughout primary school years.
And why was that? Why was it important for it to work beyond early years?
Because play is really fundamental for children. It's really important to their well-being. It's one of their UN-sanctioned rights. But it's also a really good way of educating children in ways that actually feeds off of their core motivation to learn. Children naturally want to explore and they want to understand things. Sometimes we try to put them into quite rigid structures about the ways that they're meant to learn that don't always work for them. So play pedagogy is a way of making it more child-centred and developing projects together that don't necessarily have a defined end goal, but through that process of discovery, they learn in a way that suits them. So it's not just something that works for early years, it's actually something that would work for any age of children, and that would include secondary school, but we needed to start somewhere, and the word play is so often associated with younger children, but actually play pedagogy is really about just child-centred learning and trying to put them at the centre of what that looks like, rather than trying to get children to fit within the existing systems we have.
Thank you. We can turn now perhaps to have a discussion about your other main project, which you refer to at paragraph 14, and that's the hashtag Youth and COVID series. Before we go on to look at some of the findings of that, could you please explain how APIC came to undertake this project and, importantly, why?
Yes, so we started to think about the Scott Youth and COVID project at the end of March and in early April 2020 as we went into lockdown. I think like all other organisations in the sector and beyond, there are a lot of tough decisions that were having to be made. A lot of things were just being cut off. All of our work had been put on pause. And we also knew that there were a lot of other organisations that were having to think of like furloughing staff and having to make very big decisions about what kind of services they can still offer. So we felt that through all of this, at the same time, children and young people are also experiencing something completely new that there's no precedent for, and just because we're in a crisis doesn't mean that their participation and their well-being isn't important. So we made that decision that if all of our other projects are on the back burner right now, then we've got this opportunity to do something live and working with children and young people to find out what are these first days of lockdown like, what's changed for them, what could be better. And because my colleague, who's one of the other co-directors of A Place in Childhood, has a background in online qualitative research, he felt that he had the skills to be able to convene something that was entirely online and therefore would be fine to do during COVID. So we had to think about how we could make this happen, and we just decided to put the rest of our remaining money into trying to get something that would really highlight what's going on in the lockdown from children and young people's own perspectives. So we decided that based on other projects we'd done, we could put together as diverse a panel as possible of young people from across the country, and actually they could then interact online, and we would be able to see what's going on in all of these different places as well, and give those young people an opportunity to think about what could be improved from their experience, with the idea as well that that might be something that Scottish Government or other partners might be quite keen to hear, especially considering a lot of existing participatory projects would have kind of come to an end for now.
And why was it important? I think you mentioned you put the last of your existing money into the project. Why was it important? Why did you feel it was important to do that?
Because we felt that it's so important to have children and young people's participation, because they're the only ones that really know what's going on for them. And there might have been other projects going on, we had no idea, but to our knowledge, this is something that we could contribute, and we weren't sure that anyone else was contributing it. And I think it felt that we had the expertise to be able to try and do this online. So in some ways, we didn't have a lot to lose. We felt we should really do this for the sake of children's rights, and because we've got an opportunity to, and we can see a pathway to make it work.
You produced a report, Key Findings from Children and Young People's Participation in Crisis report, that's been lodged with your statement. I don't propose to go to it now, but could you please just describe the work. You've mentioned putting together a panel of children from work that you or engagement you'd previously had. Could you please describe a little bit about the project, what it looked like?
Yes, of course. So we convened our panel of 25 what we called young consultants. So they were between the ages of 10 and 16 at that point. We decided that 10 was probably the youngest we felt that we could really work with online without having done this before. And that 10 to 16 age group, it would give us a really good insight of what's going on for those young people that are at about that transition from primary into secondary, and then those that are also looking at exams and their future beyond school. So we convened from 5 different areas. We had 5 young consultants in each, and the areas were Aberdeen, Edinburgh, Glasgow, rural Stirlingshire and rural Falkirk. And so we had a mix of ages, we had a mix of different places, and we also tried to get an even gender split to the extent we could. We were also looking to, across the places that we knew we could recruit from, try to find a mix of different types of areas, so different socioeconomic backgrounds of children and young people. So whilst 25 is not a big number overall, we were really selecting for diversity of experiences to kind of bring to the table so that we could have a good understanding of to what extent some experiences might be universal, some might be based on age, some might be based on place, or some might be based on other circumstances that the young people were dealing with. So we brought them together online initially for 3 workshops. We thought that would be a good starting point, and that is kind of the money that we had to see what would happen. So we convened those workshops in sort of April, May time of 2020. And we tried to keep the questions just really broad, because what we could see happening was that where there was participation of young people, it was a lot of surveys, and surveys can collect really great data, but for one thing, young people often don't fill out surveys for a multitude of reasons. And for another, when you're producing a survey for young people to fill out, an adult has already decided what it's important to ask about. So we wanted to find out what the young people thought was important to ask about. So we had really broad questions such as, what changes have you experienced since lockdown happened? What challenges have you experienced in relation to those changes? And, are there things that have been positive? Are there things that have been more challenging? And then over the course of these workshops, that also evolved into what changes did they think could make a difference to their experience. Particularly, some of them were bigger changes, such as, actually having a crisis plan for when schools need to lock down, the whole country needs to lock down, and we have situations like this, but also just small things that could have been different, such as setting outdoor tasks, especially for, say, PE, for instance. So that was just some of the things they came up with.
So you've already touched on some of the things that came out of it. What were the general broad findings, and were there recommendations, or what was the outcome of the report?
So the broad findings, I think, was that for the young people, everything had changed very fast, and I think it had for all of us, but it was very difficult for a lot of them to comprehend what was going on, and the messaging wasn't really for them, and there was a lot of complication and a lot of things to be scared about. There were also huge changes in the way that education was now being delivered, and quite a lot of diversity as well. So pupils were really missing the ability to collaborate with their classmates. Some schools were able to do a bit of live teaching, some didn't seem to be doing any at all. Some young people seemed to have access to good resources like iPads and things to do their work, whilst some only had access to a phone or one shared device. They didn't all have access to good enough internet or space within their homes to be working. So some had kind of already disengaged, and they thought, this isn't going to go on for very long, so I just won't bother. Some were finding it easier because actually having that space from school was really good for their different learning styles or anxieties that they might have, or different learning needs that they had. So it was quite diverse in the experiences, and some were good and some were bad. some were spending more time outdoors, some were spending less time outdoors due to various fears. And also some young people were telling us things like, we don't have paper in our home, which we need to work, but we also can't get paper in the area that we live. We would actually have to travel quite far to get something like that, which we're technically not meant to be doing. And then also it's an added expense, and not every young person had access to those kinds of resources at home to be able to buy all of these materials. So it was really quite diverse, I think, in what was going on for them.
And you discuss, I think, the key impacts at paragraphs 22 to 23 of your report. And as you noted, some were positive and some were negative, and I think you specifically mentioned, as you've already done, some positive examples about being able to spend more time with family, have more time to watch movies they liked or play video games. And as you've already mentioned there, the weather was nice and some were able to go outdoors. But then you've touched on, but in here you also state about some of the struggles that people had at school, and I think worried about grandparents. And then at paragraph 26, some specific concerns about remote learning. Is there anything in particular about education that they were raising that was of concern?
So I think it was, as I said before, some of that lack of ability to actually engage because they didn't have the resources was a big concern. And I think another thing was young people just feeling like they're not getting like feedback on their work. So they didn't really know how to respond if they didn't feel like they were getting that good feedback. And they might have to send maybe an email to a teacher if they knew how, or they might have to get a parent to help them. Not everyone had parents around, but it can be very difficult when you're that age and you've never done any of this before to even know how to ask a good question to get the kind of feedback and support you need. And then there would obviously be a delay in getting that feedback back. And then that feedback might be useful or it might not be useful, or you might have no idea how to interpret it. So it led to kind of this lag and a lot of frustration and a lot of confusion. And we could see that some were already just starting to completely disengage from learning because of just how difficult that experience was for them. And it's also just that lack of being able to do group work. So something that the young people seemed to really respond well to in the project was that on the online environment we were using, like Zoom and an online whiteboard platform, they were able to get into smaller groups and collaborate on things with people from their area, but also people not from their area. But they said that that's not something that they were really getting at school, and a huge number of young people really benefit from that kind of working together. So when that was taken away, it made a lot of school quite hard for a lot of people.
Thank you. And you mentioned earlier what you'd hope to do. Who was the target audience for this report? Was there a target audience in mind, or was this...
Our target audience, I think, primarily was Scottish Government, because we were concerned that there wasn't very much done to actually hear what young people needed and what young people were going through. So we thought there might also be wider interest in the work, and also from the young people involved, we also wanted them to feel valued and that they'd been heard. But we were hoping that Scottish Government would see this as something useful for their planning for if this happened again, but also how we might respond in future to some of these concerns that young people have raised.
And in terms of why it's important to hear from young people, presumably there was evidence being collected from teachers, etc., about the impacts on children. Why is it important to hear from, or is it important to hear directly from children or not?
I think it's because children have knowledge that we can't know without asking them. They experience these things day to day, and they're the ones that can really express how it feels and what their specific struggles are. So teachers and parents, they see it from one perspective, but children sometimes see it from a different perspective and add really key details about what's going on for them, but they also often are able to see the solutions to what's going on for them, and that might not always come from adults who see it only from their perspective. I think particularly around things around well-being, it's really the children that know how they're feeling and knowing what is and isn't working. So if we don't listen to them, then we're actually missing just a really key part of the picture. And also in listening to them, it has a really big impact on their self-esteem and their sense that they are being valued by the services that are meant to support them. And I think one of the key things that really came out from this report, but also future reports, was just that they felt that these systems that were meant to be caring for them, suddenly it felt like a lot of the care had disappeared. And a huge amount of that care, I think, comes from actually feeling heard and valued. And no matter how much, in many ways, teachers and parents are trying to do that, like remotely in this kind of learning situation, it's very, very difficult for them to actually feel that if there's not people directly interacting with them and asking, how are you doing? Not just, here's something I think you should do. It's kind of about how the young person feels and their sense of efficacy.
Thank you. Then, so just with the target audience in mind, you tried to get in touch, I think, with the Scottish Government. You referred to that at paragraph 34. What were you hoping to achieve there?
So we were hoping that the Scottish Government would find it useful to have these insights, and that particularly that report finished with a set of those small changes that could make a big difference, which I think I've outlined some of already. And we wanted government to have those and potentially be willing to discuss them and see if there was a route forward. Particularly, we thought that there might be discussions that could be had about with young people, essentially to further define what a curriculum within this crisis might look like that meets their needs as well as the needs of the system. So we wanted to get in touch to let them know that the outputs existed, but also that there was a further opportunity, if they were open to it, to engage further with our young consultants who were already primed and ready to do this work, to think about potential solutions.
And what was the response?
So the response from Scottish Government was pretty much that everything is in hand and that they didn't foresee us needing to go into another period of remote learning because this crisis at that time has mostly been averted and can be managed in a different way, but also that if we do need to go back into remote learning, then they will call upon the eSchool platform, which is already created and should therefore fill the gaps. I think that is the crux of their response to us.
Okay. You then come on in your report to discuss a second youth and hashtag Scott Youth and COVID-2, children and young people's participation through the crisis project. How did that come about then?
So we very much felt that this was kind of the start of the conversation because we'd only been able to run a few workshops, and it was clear that this crisis was actually, we thought, I think like everyone, it might only last for a few months and then things might get back to more of a semblance of normal. But it was clear sort of upon publishing the report that that wasn't necessarily the case. And from getting that report out, I think it was on Twitter, the Children's Commissioner at the time reached out to us and said that they found our work really helpful and asked if there was anything that they might do to support in getting that work out there, or, you know, thinking further about how young people could be involved. So we had a chat about that and we discussed a bit more about the project and, you know, just what an opportunity we felt we had to continue engaging with this group who are able to give their opinions live on what's happening. And the Commissioner agreed that there would be value in continuing the conversation, and therefore they agreed to financially support us and to support us also in deciding what a future round should look like. So they supported us so that we could engage more with the young consultants around kind of the end of the second lockdown, and they commissioned essentially a project that was about twice the size to continue that conversation.
And could you then just, again, you've obviously explained the methodology and who was involved in the first one. Could you please do the same again for this second one?
Yes, certainly. So we re-engaged with the original young consultants that we had pulled together, but also some additional young people that wanted to be part of it when others didn't. So it was mostly the same set, but with some slightly new faces as part of the conversation, slightly bigger team. And we did something very similar to what we'd done in the first round, but we had 6 workshops, I believe, this time round. So we started off with looking back at what had happened since we'd finished the previous round to get a sense of what's been going on and to kind of fill in that gap. So they told us lots of other changes that had been occurring and what things had maybe been the same, what things had changed, and new ideas they might have about how things could be improved. And then we kept the conversation going around what's happening to them now, what issues are arising. And through these conversations over time, what emerged was like a set of themes that were really strongly common amongst everyone, but certain people had specific interests in specific areas. So we got to a point where most of the discussions that had been happening in breakout groups were in these place-based groups initially, where they had, in-person links with each other and they knew each other somewhat beforehand. But then we started to get into different groups, which we called task forces, and these were based on the different themes that they'd outlined as really important. So we had these new task forces with new teammates that were mixing across areas, sometimes across ages, and they then worked together to put together like set of asks of the Scottish Government that they would like the Scottish Government to know about and to take forward based on things that had been arising for them as important. So there were quite a few different task forces. I think there was motivation in school, uncertainty, transitions, particularly between primary and secondary, but also out of secondary. There was well-being, skills and employment, and then also one looking at more local issues that were happening within individual communities.
And you produced a report on the back of that. Again, what happened with that report? What was the next stage?
So that report, it contained a final set of 34 asks that the young consultants had refined through their conversations based under each of those headings. And we published that, I think it was July 2021, working with the Children's Commissioners team. And there was a lot more media interest in this report this time round. So one of our young consultants was invited onto Good Morning Scotland with BBC Radio Scotland alongside the Commissioner at the time, and they had a chat about the report and that young person's experiences of school during the time that we'd been covering. And then there was also, I think it's called the morning programme after that, where there was a kind of a round discussion about the report, which I was on alongside some other guests and another young person. And so BBC Radio Scotland had reached out to Scottish Government to get a response from them to play as part of that work. And so we got a response from them in relation to it.
And you've mentioned the themes, and in paragraph 34, you refer to 34 asks. Was that part of that project?
Yes.
And what happened with the 34 asks?
So the 34 asks were in the report, and they were what was communicated, I think, in our outputs and also to the media and in the radio shows.
And you then go on to talk about a third project, which is a series of blogs, I understand. So could you please explain again how you came to do that third project and what the methodology was?
Yes, so obviously at the end of the second round, we had this list of 34 asks, but we also, as part of that, had spoken to the young people about what they would want to happen with those 34 asks. And they told us that whilst they thought that they'd done a really thorough job between them of putting together these sets of asks, they were also really aware that they were only a group of 25 young people from specific areas, and that there would certainly be young people from other geographic areas or from other kind of experiences that they didn't have that they felt should be contributing to any work that gets communicated further about how we should move forward from the pandemic. So with their instruction that we should be involving more young people, particularly those that have had potentially harder experiences or from different age groups and different backgrounds to them, we spoke with the Children's Commissioner about what a third round of the report would look like. And so that third round, Scott Youth and COVID 3, was quite an extensive project, and it involved various different streams. So on one hand, we kept up regular workshops with our original young consultants, who were kind of steering us through the project, telling us what had been going on for them in the interim and right at those points in time. Also, sort of, I guess, overall editorial on the project. And then we also convened a set of primary school young consultants. There were 15 of them from the same areas as the older young consultants, so that we could hear from current 8 to 10-year-olds as well, and what had been happening for them. So I think we had 2 or 3 workshops with them. But we also had groups, we had workshops with what we were calling seldom heard groups. So we worked with the Commissioner's office to get in touch with various groups that might have specific experiences that it would be worth sharing and are likely to have been missed so far. So we had 2 groups of young carers, one in Edinburgh, which we met in person, and one that crosses the Highlands but is based in Dingwall, so we spoke to them online, a group of them. We also spoke with unaccompanied refugees and asylum seekers in partnership with the Scottish Refugee Council, and we also spoke to children that have a family member in prison during the pandemic, and also long COVID kids who had experienced long COVID during the pandemic and so had specific experiences to share. And so the project from there was a mixture of convening these new workshops and then producing blogs, sharing those with our original young consultants and talking about those additional insights with them whilst gathering their additional insights. And then from all of that, we were working together to finalise like a manifesto for change, which is what the young consultants and other young people we'd spoken to felt should be taken forward as a result of the pandemic. So not everything about it relates directly to what happened in the pandemic, but it's like young people's view of a future of Scotland having experienced something like this and what they think would be a better future for everyone. So that was the kind of the very final output of the whole project.
And just in terms of the penultimate output, you produced a series of reports in relation to each of the themes or the groups that the young people had identified. Had they come up with the groups themselves, or was that a combination of them and the Commissioner?
It was a combination of them and the Commissioner. So they had specifically said that they wanted us to focus on young people that have had experiences different to theirs, particularly experiences that might have been harder than some that they've experienced. And they also said that they'd quite like different geographies involved. So I think they mentioned, like the Highlands, Fife, Dundee, those were places that we hadn't done any work. So they wanted to make sure that this was as close to representative of every young person in Scotland as possible.
And could I perhaps ask you, you have it in your report, but just to give us an indication with reference to the groups of what sorts of impacts or experiences these particular groups were experiencing. Perhaps we can start with young carers.
Yeah, so the young carers, they had had quite a lot of different experiences, I'd say, from, say, our young consultants and other young people. I remembered that one of the things that was quite difficult for them during a lot of the quite strict rules that we had is that a lot of them applied to, children aren't allowed to do things like go into supermarkets or go into pharmacies, but actually for a lot of young carers, that is something that is fundamental to their responsibilities as a young carer. And so they would need to actually be kind of fighting their own case that they had to be able to be doing these things, which is obviously incredibly stressful for them and stressful for their parents as well, who, you know, they're asking their young people to do this often because they don't have a lot of choices, so they felt bad for being in that situation. So there was a lot of stress, I think, in a lot of people's families, and the young carers were also more likely to have experienced like the death of a loved one or severe health difficulties of someone they lived with who was then having to get healthcare during the pandemic, which was obviously disrupted. And then there was also the fact that they would then be maybe going back to school, really, really worried about contracting COVID and passing that on to someone vulnerable within their household, but not really having very much choice around that. So there was a lot of guilt and shame and trauma, I think, attached to that. And I remember that there was also, because a lot of these young carers would be taking care of younger siblings who might need a lot more support at school, or also I remember one young person was telling us that their sister wasn't like needed to read people's lips and wasn't able to whilst people were wearing masks, and that was a really difficult experience for everyone, and that her sister just basically stopped going out because it was too difficult. And all of this was just an extra strain on young carers who were already doing a huge amount extra, that's often not understood, having the same kind of school experiences as well, where a lot of the extra support that they may have been getting if they were in school was much harder to deliver whilst remotely. So it was a very difficult and I think also very varied experience for them as well, because these experiences were common across, you know, Edinburgh and the Highlands, but in the Highlands there was also that added level of remoteness that was quite difficult for a lot of young people, and meant that even when things sort of lightened up in terms of the restrictions, it was still very difficult for them to actually meet people and get to places that they might need to get to.
Thank you. And the other group you had identified, all the young children and young people had identified, was the primary school pupils. Please could you elaborate a bit more about what their experiences and concerns were?
Sure. So the primary school pupils, a lot of them were quite young when all of this kicked off, so they weren't necessarily as immediately aware of why some of their experiences might be related to the pandemic or the sort of the seriousness of what was going on. But a lot of what they told us they remembered was really, really missing seeing friends, because a lot of them would have been very young. They wouldn't have had mobile phones, or even if they did, they wouldn't have had numbers for their friends necessarily. And so they went from having friends and seeing people all the time to potentially seeing barely anyone. And some of them had, you know, good experiences at school. We did hear some really good innovative work with like one young person talking about how their teacher had actually worked really, really hard to make sure that they could still have group collaboration whilst they were learning remotely, and use something like Minecraft education so that everyone in the class could be creating something together and having fun, and would do things like having an hour where everyone can come together and ask questions every day. But some, it seems, didn't get very much teaching at all, and that it seems like, I think because they were so young, it's very difficult to teach a lot of things like reading and writing remotely, so they didn't necessarily get very much of that. And I think the other thing that was really strong from the primary age pupils was they were incredibly frustrated, and I think very, very angry. Actually, at the time that we were talking, there had been a lot of talk about the parties in Westminster, and they were absolutely furious that that was happening. Yeah, they really wanted to talk about it quite a lot, because they thought that they'd had to follow so many different rules, and yet the decision makers that are meant to be caring for everyone didn't seem to care. So that was, I think, that just felt like a massive sort of moral injury to them.
Your next group you have is refugees and asylum seekers. What were their particular concerns?
Yeah, so the group of refugees and asylum seekers that we worked with, they had arrived during the pandemic, but they were not necessarily able to comment on whether or not their experiences were because of the pandemic. And I also must be clear as well that I couldn't comment on whether or not things had changed for them because of the pandemic or if this would have happened anyway. But they had quite a lot of distressing experiences that they did want to share with us. So because these young people had arrived unaccompanied, they were in state care, and a lot of them didn't feel that they had very good relationships with those that were meant to be caring for them, and they felt that the role that the people within the Scottish Refugee Council were doing a lot more to care for them than their state-sponsored carers, who some of them felt were not really supporting them in getting to know the sort of day-to-day of life in Scotland and how various things work that they really need to understand, like bills and shopping and things such as that. So a lot of them felt quite alone. They also commented on how they'd arrived in Glasgow together, but then they had been split up and sent to different local authorities, and they didn't know why, and they felt like they'd been separated from people that they knew. And I think those that had been put into rural areas very much felt that they wanted to be in Glasgow, where they had that sense of community. But I think the really main thing that came from them is that they really wanted to be able to mix with other young people their own age. But what was happening for them is that they were being put into college to learn English with a lot of people of all different ages, mostly much older. And you know, they said that there's plenty of nice people around, but they really want to be with young people their own age, and they want to be learning skills for their future and potentially learning English through more apprenticeship style schemes and getting to interact with others. And I remember one of them talking as well about how they were 16 but they weren't allowed to go to school, and they were never able to go to school in their own country. And so they were really looking forward to and hoping that they'd be able to go to school in Scotland, but instead they had to go to college, and most of the people around them were in their 30s and 40s, and that was feeling very isolating for them.
Thank you. Then you've got a group of young people with family in prison. If you could tell us about their experiences.
Sure. So the young people that had a family member in prison, a lot of them, I think very understandably, really struggled with the lack of contact with their family member who they were used to being able to see on at least a semi-regular basis. There was a huge amount of uncertainty about when and whether they would be able to see that person, which was incredibly distressing and very stressful on the family. And they also weren't able to attend the support groups that they were used to attending in person due to the pandemic for a while, which was extra distressing for them. But the other thing that also came through really strongly from that group, and I think this is partly just because of the age that they were, but some of them were going through that transition from primary school to secondary school, which was also very, very disrupted by what was going on, and they didn't feel prepared at all for going to secondary school, and that some important sort of rites of passage of being able to go and visit your school and get to know everything had kind of been taken away from them, and so they were really worried about that at the time we spoke to them.
And we've heard a bit about transitions and how important it is, particularly for different stages, transitioning from primary to secondary or early learning to primary. Why was it particularly impactful for this group, or were they just reflecting how difficult it was for the rest of the their cohort, as in their age?
Yeah, I think that they were reflecting how difficult it was for their cohort, but I think for them particularly as well, having had the experiences that they had and the uncertainties that they were dealing with, I think it was somewhat heightened for them, and so I think that they just really wanted to talk about them because it was very present on their mind. But I should say we did hear very similar things from our original young consultants who were transitioning from primary to secondary school at the time of that first report as well, though at that time I guess they couldn't go really at all, and at this point they could do little bits of things. But I remember one of the participants of this group was talking about how they had had a visit from a secondary school teacher to tell them things that they didn't think were really useful, like how to pack their bags, when what they really wanted to know was, what does the school look like? How do I get to where I'm going? What are the expectations on me? And they didn't use these words, but it sounded like what they were saying was that a lot of what was going on was a bit trivial to the situation that's actually at hand.
Thank you. And then another group you had, I think the last group was Long COVID Kids Scotland. You engaged with them as well.
Yes, so we spoke with a group, I think they were between the ages of 8 and 16 online with long COVID kids. So, and we also spoke with their parent carers as part of that as well. So they were experiencing a huge amount of isolation, and I'd also say a huge amount of anger from some of them. So I think because there had been so much talk in the press, and I think from government as well, that COVID doesn't really affect children and that it's safe for children to go back to school, I think it felt particularly difficult for them because they felt completely unseen, and like everyone was just taking their experiences incredibly trivially, like they didn't matter. So there was a huge amount of anger about that, I think, understandably, and some of those young people's lives had been really seriously impacted. So some were having better times than others and had school environments that were like quite supportive and doing their best to help the young people feel included when they could go in. But some young people just couldn't go to school at all, and they felt that there wasn't a lot of care and understanding about why that was the case. But one thing I did think was really important about what they talked about, especially the older ones, was that the period where there was more remote learning actually in some ways was much easier for them to engage with as someone with a serious illness, because they could do it at their own pace and they could get the materials, and they felt like they were missing out less. Whereas actually just when it went much more back to normal for everyone else, it was more of a problem for them, because then they couldn't balance their energies appropriately. And they had, for those that had exams coming up, I think it was particularly stressful that they were being expected to either sit exams when they didn't feel that it was going to be very easy for them or even possible, or really frustrated that due to having had COVID and now having long COVID, which a lot of people were sort of suggesting young people couldn't have, and that they weren't getting a lot of dispensation for that, but then also their whole lives, to them, it felt like had been sort of put on pause, and that they, you know, at one moment something great was happening for them, and then the next it was going to take them 3 years to finish, you know, 1 year's worth of exams. So it was hugely upending for them and their families.
Thank you. Dr. Wood, you mentioned the manifesto, and this was the culmination of the work. What's happened to that? What's the next step after that?
So the manifesto, we released that, I can't remember exactly when we released it, but it was quite an extensive manifesto that had a set of, I think it was 5 changes, and then a set of principles about basically the Scotland that they would like to see and how they think it could come about.
I just for reference, it's paragraph 89 of your statement.
Okay.
I don't know if it's possible to bring it up. I think the changes start earlier, so I don't know if you need that in front of you, but from paragraph 75, it's heading Children and Young People's Manifesto, Future Improvements.
Yes.
Excuse me.
So, yeah, so they had a set of principles about what they would like the future to look like, and these principles were equality, understanding, dialogue, care, purpose, and environment. And then they had these big changes related to those, and a huge amount of them were related to care in their education and care in the systems that support them. And so we released those as a draft manifesto, and the idea, and the young people really wanted this to be tested with as many young people as possible. So we put together a survey and a facilitators pack to get this out there to as many children and young people as possible, to see if they agreed or if they thought there were important things that were missing or really important things that we'd need to taken out of a manifesto that represents what they want from the future. Unfortunately, we didn't actually have the resource to launch it to the extent we wanted to. So it didn't, we have the full manifesto and it's a huge amount of work has gone into it, but it's not actually something we've been able to test with nearly as many young people as we would like, but it has been something that has fed all of our work since, and I think has also contributed a lot to the Children's Commission of work around what children and young people would like to see from their future. And yeah, as I said, a huge amount of it is about thinking about how education can be much more centred on children and young people's needs and involve them at every stage and help them feel cared for and motivated through it, as well as social and health systems that really meet people's needs at every stage as well.
Thank you. And then finally, Dr. Wood, can I ask you to mention if there are any lessons to be learned? We've obviously got your statement, but any particular lessons that you think could be learned from either the project that you undertook or just generally?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's a huge number of lessons that could be learned, and I think that the young people's set of 34 asks and their manifesto for future changes, I think, lay out really a huge number of what those learnings could be. But I think in summary, from my perspective of working with them, I think the first one would be that there needs to be a plan for if something like this happens again. And it needs to be a coordinated plan with resource and with consistency, because there was just so many different things going on all at once that young people's education and their care didn't seem to be very top priority to be doing something about, and it was different in different areas and it was a bit of a patchwork. But at the same time, young people had a lot of shared experiences about what could be better. So I think there's a huge amount of learning in, if we had to go back to remote learning, having a clear model in place that would still prioritise things like hearing what's happening to young people in their own terms, really caring about their well-being, making sure there's opportunities to collaborate. And I think also being really careful about what gets taught and how it gets taught, because I know some of the reflections from our older young consultants as well was that in some ways they feel that the education they had during the pandemic, that understandably teachers were trying not to overload them, and a lot of them did feel overloaded and it was very overwhelming, but they've since realised, like trying to go to university for instance, that there were things that were taken out of their course that actually is now really fundamental for them to know, and now they feel behind. And similarly with exams, we need to have some kind of system of what we're going to do with exams that is consistent and is fair and doesn't penalise young people for where they live or for what's going on for them. And I think that a lot of young people felt that that really wasn't in place during the pandemic, and they're really worried about whether or not qualifications they've got now really mean as much as if they were got in, say, 2019 or 2024. So they feel a little bit lost in that. So I think those are a couple of really key things. But I think that sense of just care and making sure that young people feel cared for is the thing that has really come through all of this work, because there's a lot of young people now that feel quite disengaged from school and also just in general feel quite disengaged, and I think we're seeing it more and more in the work we do in schools. It has maybe levelled off a little bit from the heights of just after the pandemic, but there seems to be a lot more disengagement, absenteeism, young people struggling to regulate their behaviour in the environments that we have. And there's a lot of opportunities that they seem to have lost that don't seem to be coming back, or if they have come back, young people aren't aware that they can engage with them again. So young people need a lot more support now with what they can be doing with their mental health and with their education. And I think that there's a bit of a tendency to go back to normal. But we've gone back to normal, and I can definitely say from being in schools before and being in schools after, it is quite different, like the behaviour that you see and what young people seem to be going through, and the level of loneliness that we witnessed amongst young people during these projects, but also that we're witnessing now going into schools, and when, you know, a 13-year-old will actually tell you as a relative stranger that they are lonely, I think that says quite a lot and is quite worrying. So I think we need to be doing a lot more that is not just about investing in our standard child and adolescent mental health services, but is also about community and young people talking to each other and having opportunities to socialise, to play, to hang out, to be in their communities and to feel valued. Because I don't think that the breadth of issues that have arisen through this are going to be solved by just each individual young person that needs it having access to a single mental health professional. I think that we need a much more broad strokes and preventative approach than we have at the moment.
Dr. I almost forgot. Just in relation to the SQA and the alternative certification model, were there any particular aspects of that that were arose or were mentioned by the young consultants you engaged with?
Yes, so that definitely happened to quite a few of our young consultants that were in older years, and from different areas they were also able to kind of compare notes on what was happening in their various schools. So there was a lot of very palpable frustration and anger, particularly around the results that were determined by the algorithm. We had young people from one area where they were basically saying, oh, you know, I got A's, but my A's mean nothing because everyone is getting A's because of where we live. And then someone who was, you know, on track to get A's and then was given all D's because of the place she lived, was basically saying it's impossible for me to achieve because someone has just decided that the place I live means I can't. So there was huge anger, and we could see that real like diversity of experience from talking with them. So it was, I think, just clearly incredibly unfair, and obviously it did get changed in the end, but the young people, I think, lost a lot of trust in the system from having been through that and having put in a huge amount of work in difficult circumstances, and then that's what happened to them. They were not okay about it at all.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wood. My Lord, I have no further questions for Dr. Wood.
Very good. Thank you very much indeed. Yes, thank you, Dr. Wood. That's all. We're well ahead of schedule, Miss van der Westerhuizen. We're due back at 3:15. I know that Miss Stewart's asked for a little extra time. If it's possible to come back before then, I'm more than happy to do it, but I don't know if that can be arranged or not. I'll just leave it to you to see what can be done, if anything.
Thank you, my Lord. I will take it upstairs.
Thank you. Very good. If I don't hear to the contrary, 3:15.
I brought some in, but
Good afternoon, Lord Brailsford.
Good afternoon, Miss Stewart. You've got a witness for us? No, you've got two, I do beg your pardon.
I do, yes, my lord. We have a panel of two this afternoon. Miss Whitelock of the organisation LEAD, Linking Education and Disability, and Mr Reid of the Scottish Transitions Forum, facilitated by the organisation ARC.
Very good. Good afternoon, Miss Whitelock and Mr Reid.
good afternoon.
Thank you.
Good. Now, when you're ready, Miss Stewart.
Mr Reid, can you please tell us your full name?
Do I need to press the button to speak, or is it just
No, your microphones are on. Both
my
your microphones
full name
are on.
and title, or just full name?
Yes, your full name, please.
Yeah, it's Scott Richardson Reid.
Thank you. And is it okay if we address you as Mr Reid?
Yeah, it's shorter.
That's what we've been addressing you as so far. And you provided a response to a Rule 8 request from the inquiry, is that right?
That's correct, yeah.
And this can be found at SCI-ARC-5 zeros and a 7. And Miss Whitelock, your full name, please.
Emma Whitelock,
Thank you. And you've provided a witness statement to the inquiry.
correct, yes.
And this can be found at WT 0197. Now, your respective witness statement and Rule 8 set out information for us about your work on supporting people to transition from children's services to adult services. Now, we're interested in hearing from you today in connection with this transition in relation to education services. First of all, by way of background, Ms Whitelock, can you please tell us a bit about LEAD, about what its work involves and what your role is, in particular, insofar as it relates to education?
Great, thank you for that. Well, unusually I've had 8 jobs at Leeds Scotland, and I've been the CEO since 2015. So I've got some strategic and operational knowledge about post-school education and disability. I guess I lead the organisation taking forward our strategic ambition. We support disabled people and unpaid carers, and we support people to move forward into further learning, volunteering, employability pathways and work. We provide local learning opportunities, local learning services in 9 local authority areas, online opportunities across Scotland. We've got befriending services in Fife. We run Scotland's national helpline for disabled people. A lot of people going through transition from that helpline. And we support people to have a say via our policy work.
Thank you. And can I ask you, what's the profile of LEAD's service users in respect of what their needs are, what age they are?
Yeah, great question. So I'd say the kind of profile is that learners are generally aged 16 right through life into 90s, and we've got different projects giving different targeted approaches. But what might be in common with a lot of people is lacking confidence. Some people lack expectation, not knowing where to start, what options there are, seeking guidance. We act as a bridge to connect people with their ambition and then support people in a person-centred way, one-to-one, often with a home visit, to get started. And from there, then the first step can be taken. Will they be learning at home, learning in the community, moving to college, employability pathways? It's person-centred, so lots and lots of different journeys, lots of partners involved. And then we will exit and they will move on to a sustained pathway, if that gives enough of an overview.
It does, thank you. In terms of just thinking about your title, Linking Education and Disability, are all your service users, are they disabled?
Most people are disabled, and we work with some unpaid carers primarily because they experience similar barriers. And when we say disabled people, some people don't identify with that label, so we don't ask people to prove that. But most people would be disabled under the wider definition of the Equality Act. And we work with people pan-impairment, people with mental health difficulties, physical impairments, sensory impairments, really quite a lot. We've got a great breadth of people who come and use our services.
Thank you. And one of the projects that LEAD was involved in was that it formed the Transitions Forum, which Mr Reid is is a part of.
Yeah.
Can you please tell us a little bit, Mr. Reid, about the forum, again, what its work involves and your own role in particular concerning education?
Yeah, my official title is, I forgot what my title was there for a second, Policy and Development Worker or Policy and Development Officer for the Scottish Transitions Forum. And the Scottish Transitions Forum works with organisations like LEAD in the third sector and what you would call NGOs, I guess, or voluntary sector organisations alongside education, health, social work, employability, skills development, Scotland, transport benefits, anyone who has skin in the game to help young people move from being a young person into young adult life or adult life. And we primarily focus within the 14 to 25-year-old age range with young people, and we use the phrase additional support needs because it encompasses all of the additional support needs that young people might have, including disability, autism, mental health, etc., which might have a focus for this inquiry today. So, primarily we bring together these organisations like LEAD and others. We're a membership organisation, but it's not paid. We have over 1,120 members. I checked this morning, so that's hot off the presses. Who we encourage and help to work together to improve transitions for that particular demographic in Scotland.
Thank you. And you mentioned in your Rule 8 response that the divergent influencers are an important part of the work that you do. Can you tell us a bit about who these people are and what they're seeking to achieve and influence?
Yeah, the Divergent Influences is their Sunday name. I tend to call them the DIs because it's a bit easier. So the DIs, or the Divergent Influences, are a group of young people with additional support needs who represent an intersectional cross-section of young people that have gone through transition and moved into young adult life in Scotland. All the work that we do strategically is based around the experience and the lived experience of the groups of young people and others and young adults that some of my colleagues work with around what it is that makes a difference. So the DIs obviously were going through transition during the pandemic, which I was working alongside, and we just formed as a group in 2019, and we had our first proper meeting actually it was January, I think, just as people started to talk about the pandemic. So we got to know each other very well and what was going on in those years of the pandemic, actually, and did a lot of work together. So.
Thank you. And I want to ask you a little bit more about the DIs a little bit later on. I want to focus with you both this afternoon on post-school transitions. I'm aware you deal with transitions at all ages and stages of education, but for today I want to focus on post-school. Miss Whitelock, could you explain to us what transitions are and why they're important?
Well, moving from children, being a young person into your next step as an adult can be a real cliff edge for young people and families. So it's really important that they're supported, that the right people are in the room, sufficient breadth of options and opportunities are looked at, and that people make informed choices about what's next. It's really it's also a key time. There's a lot of other scaffolding that needs to be put in place for successful transitions. So it's moving from school into college or community-based education or employability pathways, but it might also be looking at housing, moving from children to adult services, health, and there's lots and lots of things going on at that stage. So it's a very stressful time for people. It's also an important time to stick with people and support people through it, because it's easy for this sort of overwhelming period to disengage. And so really providing continuity of support, that's really important. It can fall down at various parts of it, so it's important to do it. And it's important for families too. If somebody's been at school for 5 days a week and then they move on to, and they've not been supported into the next steps appropriately, they may end up doing something for half a day a week, which impacts not only on that young person, there's a waste of their talent and potential. It may be that family members have to give up work to stay and support people as well. So it can be very impactful. People worry about it, and there is a lot of fear around it. And sometimes it goes well, but sometimes it's quite challenging. Doesn't go so well, and it can have long-lasting impacts if it doesn't go well. As an organisation, we work sometimes with people in their 30s, 40s, and 50s for whom that transition pathway didn't go well, and really they're still recovering and still don't expect to be an equal citizen, have the equal opportunities to move into different pathways all through life. So it's important that people are valued and listened to, and a good starting position on that at that stressful time.
I think what you're describing is the transition planning that appears throughout your statement, Miss Whitelock, and also in the Relate response from ARC. Pre-pandemic, Miss Whitelock, what did this transition planning look like? For example, is it an event or a process, and who's involved in that?
Yeah, well, I think I'll pass this one to Scott because he's so heavily involved with the rhetoric, and I think he can add value by giving a really full answer to this one.
Of course, thank you.
Thanks, Emma.
You're welcome.
So transitions for members of the Scottish Transitions Forum isn't an event. It's not like a one and you're done thing. It's not a switch. It's not posting a letter. It's a drawn out process, and it's a process that's supported by legislation like the Additional Support for Learning Act, and its primarily responsibility for transition sits within education to draw together appropriate agencies, which is health, social work, college, skills development Scotland, anybody who's got skin in the game of helping this young person succeed. That's what the law says, and that's what should happen. But frequently, before the pandemic, it wasn't fully happening, and during the pandemic, you can imagine if it wasn't happening fully before the pandemic, it got even worse during COVID. There is rhetoric around supporting the rights for a young person to have a voice within the transitions meeting, and technically, young people can call anybody they want to come to that transitions meeting and sit around the table to help them move into young adult life. And as Emma said really eloquently, it's not just about education, employment and training for these young people, it's a whole life change. A lot of them are moving through precarious processes from children's services into adult services, which comes with responsibilities for new assessments. So those adult services might be within social work, they could be in further or higher education, they could be within health systems, they could be about learning to self-refer in terms of physio or OT, it could be, as you said, Emma, about housing, learning to drive, all the aspirations of a young person, and also within all of that transition and what the DIs and others that I've spoken to is about the maintaining and furthering of relationships and other things that sit around that whole transitions experience for a young person who's pretty excited to be leaving school that they may or may not have liked in the first place and moving into young adult life. I think we can all remember that kind of thing. But for young people with additional support needs or autism and disabled people, that's more complicated because a lot of the picture puzzle or the puzzle pieces sit with the professionals that are around that table helping you plan. And if they're not there to help you make the decision, or if they're not there to let you know about how much funding is happening or how the college accessibility is or what community opportunities might exist, you're not going to know and you're not going to be able to make that step because you don't know what you don't know. Sorry if that sounds like a bit of a riddle to Emma.
That's helpful.
Is there anything you would add, Emma?
No, just you mentioned the Additional Support Needs Act. When you're 16, it's the Equality Act. And now a lot of people, it may seem like a small point, but it's a huge point. How do you identify if somebody says, I'm a pupil with additional support needs? They then have to say, I'm a disabled person, because they're thinking under the Equality Act. And the word disability has a social stigma for some people, and they're unwilling to use that. And so as an organisation, we try and encourage people to see it as a positive way to open up, access rights and entitlements. But that can be a barrier for a lot of people even that small language change.
In terms of, you mentioned, Mr. Reid, there about effective transitions not being fully realised pre-pandemic. Why was that?
That's a good question. There's lots of reasons.
Possibly quite a complex question.
Yeah, it's really complex, and there's lots of reasons. I should have mentioned we work very strategically within Scotland, within Scottish Government, and people like ADES and the strategic bodies that help education and healthcare to kind of group together under principles and standards. And primarily we've found like 7 places where it usually falls down, and that's a lack of information, a lack of coordination, a lack of planning, people not getting the support that they need. And we're not necessarily talking about a service here, we're talking about support in the general terms. People not planning early enough, and nobody really taking accountability of the process. And it's not just one person's responsibility or one profession's responsibility. The responsibility sits across multiple different professional areas that each have a role to play. And if any of those are out of sync or not working, it will compound the issue. So you can imagine that lots of those fell by the wayside during COVID.
In terms of the timing of this, you said it doesn't always happen early enough. At what point in a child's school education would transition planning commence?
By law.
For them to consider post-school transitions?
Yeah, by law, it should happen at least a year before the young person is due to leave school. But that doesn't mean it has to happen at least a year before the young person. It can happen sooner than that. And we find for young people with complex health conditions in particular, or life-shortening conditions, that needs more planning time. And some people even start to look at transition for that young person around about the age of 14, sometimes 13, just to make sure that when they leave school, they could potentially leave at 16, I suppose, but usually they would stay on until they're 18. Everything is in place in terms of healthcare needs, social care needs, educational needs, housing needs, accessibility needs, transport needs, benefit needs, and they fully are realising their own autonomy and their rights to have a voice in the meetings that kind of follow from that, because there's a huge step change from being a young person and having your mom and dad help you make decisions in a rights-based way, then moving into the world of a young adult, and all of those decisions are now yours, because that's your right, isn't it, when you become an adult? So within the transitions process, there's also technicalities around things to do with capacity to make safe decisions, to do with welfare and financial choice. And so for parents who don't realise that their parental rights stop, have to look at things like power of attorney and guardianship and other measures to be able to legally support their young person to be able to make those choices. And that can come as a huge shock to... So we like to think of a transition not just for the young person, though the focus should be on them, but it's a transition for the entire family, including brothers and sisters potentially who might have to step into a young carer role for that sibling that they might have. So
that's very helpful, thank you. I want to come to a section of your statement with you, Ms. Whitelock. You set out for us, starting at paragraph 9, about the impact of the closure education settings had on transitions. You speak at various points throughout your statement of a breakdown of transition pathways. Can you tell us what it is you mean, and it's a phrase you've used this afternoon, a transition pathway? What's meant by that?
Well, in this case, it's going from school to what's next. And, you know, some people, the transition planning halted, so then that impacts on the pathway, or the transition planning may have started, but at the point when, you know, the COVID-19 locked everything down, then it had to change. But people weren't necessarily around to talk to what that change might look like. And so some people disengaged, and that was let to be happen, you know. And there was, some people were furloughed, as you know, which meant, we talked earlier about that kind of scaffolding of support. And if somebody was seeking mental health support as well, and they couldn't access that, or it was very, very limited, we noticed that really those problems became amplified for some people, which meant they weren't in the right headspace to continue. So these are some of the challenges. Moving online, for some people they thought, well, I've been asking to go online and I was told no, and now I can, great. And for some people, this was a big barrier. The digital exclusion is statistically worse for disabled people. And during the pandemic, just because they may get access to a device doesn't mean you know how to use it and go straight into using it to learn. If you had agreed in-class support as part of his transition pathway and planning, and that then wasn't available, then it's down to is there a family member to support? Some people reported, parents phoned the helpline, reported that young people were very anxious. There was a young person with autism, for example, who didn't want to put their camera on, and found the whole thing quite stressful. I mean, there was lots of different examples about the pathways being, from parents coming, but I don't know if we can mention it now, but one of the things I mentioned later on is that, the sector to some extent had shrunk a bit in that there were less provision, less places for people to move on to. And if we think about community learning and development, for example, that's a sector that has had reduced funding over a long period. And in the CLD plans between 2018 and 21, it was noted in an aspect review by Education Scotland, as I wrote, that actually there weren't very many options for young disabled people. Now that could have been a strong pathway for people during this period, smaller groups, local availability, but that wasn't necessarily to be there because that sector wasn't targeting it. So that means, I guess, there's a lack of available pathways, and those pathways changed, looked different, or weren't there. We were trying to have some people move into volunteering. That can be really added value to learning, active citizenship volunteering. But furloughing meant that very few places were available, and there was a lack of support for these to happen. And some things don't translate well online. If you're doing a practical course, it's hard to translate that online. I'm sure I could go on and on. There's more. Is there any that you want to answer in there while I have a think?
I was going to come to you, Mr. Reid. You've mentioned, Ms. Whitelock, about the role of other professionals, and you've given examples of social work, health, education, working alongside each other.
Actually, there's one more just to come. Just the idea about a pathway can be supported by different professionals, and what you find is that colleges and health and social services may not agree who's responsible for what aspects of this, and that worsened during COVID, we noted as well.
And did that cross-sector working worsen? You mentioned furlough. Is that the reason that it was more difficult?
Yes, I'd say that we felt a little bit more as an island, as an organisation at times, because people we were used to dealing with to support transitions had been pulled away to do other things. Now, it's understandable, we understood that, but of course it's impactful in that then some of our staff were feeling, well, what should they step into different roles, or they feel more alone, and it's frustrating for people to think, I can't move this person on because I can't get to the right person or to the right opportunity. That all changed, so that was quite difficult.
That's helpful. And just thinking there on the theme of other professionals and them being, as you say, pulled away to other roles, I want to come to you on that very point. Mr. Reid, ARC has published a report of a survey undertaken in connection with the views of parents and carers about the impact of COVID-19 and the lockdown on transition planning. Now, you've summarised the findings of those surveys very helpfully from page 9 and following of your response, and they're also on ARC's website for anybody who wishes to look at those. At page 13 of your Relate response, you're setting out the findings of that parents' survey, and you mention that there was a lack of allied health professionals. How did this impact the ability of children, young people, to have transition either into education or between education services?
again, a complex question, because different young people are engaged, as we've already kind of discussed, with different professionals around the table. Allied health professionals like educational psychologists or speech and language or OT or physio or mental health services is probably the ones I'm primarily focusing on when I say this, but there are others. That's not all of them. They, like other professions, were drawn into crisis situations within the pandemic. So, for instance, people who were getting physiotherapy for cerebral palsy, that would stop because you couldn't actually go and deliver it, which meant that people had a lessening of their physicality. Sorry, that's not a very good phrase, but their ability to get around was lessened. The mental health services really, really hard to access, and for people who, especially young people who are very anxious, and video technology is new and kind of inaccessible, or the family are in poverty, which is, there's a huge intersection between being disabled and being in poverty. They didn't have the digital equipment required to enable young people to have video call mental health support services from allied health professionals. So that fell away too, and fell onto the shoulders of the parents and the families that were supporting them. Speech and language are absolutely fundamental when it comes to the transition between, for instance, school and, say, a community space, because the speech and language professional is the one that holds the key to the communication for that young person. And even though there is a standardized approach with Boardmaker or picture symbols, these can be different for every young person that uses them, depending.
Can you tell us, sorry, I
Yeah,
don't want to
sorry.
interrupt your flow there, but you've just referred to two tools, I
Yeah.
presume, that are used. Can you just explain to us what they are?
Yeah, so they're just simply the kind of picture symbols that express, like, stop, I'm unhappy, or lunch, or toilet, or they help people communicate, and it's like also known as a PEX board. You might be familiar with them when you've seen people pointing at pictures to kind of represent what they want to do. They're not all standardized across the piece for young people. Young people use different symbols, sometimes symbols that they've created for their own particular challenges or barriers. And the speech and language therapists hold that information and help that information travel with the young person to wherever they are transitioning into. So, for instance, those communication aids might need taught to college support staff, so they know what the particular thing means, and its speech and language have a particular role in that. So as they fell away, it almost prevented young people from having a voice, because this is the way that they would be working with other professionals in the system. So yeah, there's loads of examples where people weren't able to access that support, but those are a few of them.
In terms of the impact on the young person there, you've mentioned the impact perhaps on mobility or the ability to communicate. Am I to understand your evidence is that this pause in that provision impacted their ability or their readiness to transition to another form of education?
Yes, in short. Imagine if you're a very anxious young person or somebody that needs more support, and that support's taken away and it's put on pause because people, and as Emma said, understandably, have pulled into different formats of crisis. This work that needs to happen for this young person is put on pause, and they can't necessarily connect with some of the tools that we put in place, such as I think we all remember, is it Zoom or Teams that we're using? All of those things, because of digital exclusion and poverty, and it's the intersection of all of these different things that really impact a lot of the families. So personally, I don't think you can look at this as a one single issue when it comes to transition. A lot of the young people I was working with, or two of the divergent influences,
Good afternoon, my lord.
Afternoon again, Ms Stewart.
Thank you. There was, as I said just before we broke there, a breach of our restriction order, but I'm advised that that has now been resolved and we're able to continue. Thank you, Mr. Reid. I was taking you there to a section of your Rule 8 response at page 11. Ms Whitelock had been speaking there about barriers to online learning, and you'd spoken about the removal of allied health professionals from certain of their duties in connection with these children, the impact of that. At page 11 here, you say, I think that, sorry, I should explain, this is a contribution from a parent, and you're quoting from a parent who responded to your survey, and they say, I think schools should have been extended for a year, for our guys especially. Is that a concern that was expressed strongly or repeatedly in response to your survey by the parents?
It's a response that's expressed often. There is precedent within the transitions process for that last year of a young person to be at school to do a lot of that kind of further learning that helps them be independent outside of school. So it could involve things like travel training or self-care, or so without that last year being at school, a lot of those skills aren't learned or aren't managed, or a lot of the learning that young person might be able to achieve isn't achieved. So a lot of parents asked to, and Emma might be able to come on this from a lead point of view, extend even or add an additional education year to make sure that learning is embedded, or especially focus on those skills, and that involves a lot of the transitions planning in that year. So if we reflect back to young people should be supported to transition from school according to the law at least a year before they're due to leave school. It's that year where often a lot of the professionals and allied health professionals and others and third sector organisations get literally around a table with the parent and young person and or carer and start that planning. There's also the information that should be passed on. There's an information duty 6 months before the young person is due to leave school. The school has a duty to pass on the information to whichever service that they're moving to next. So that would be passing on information to the college. So without that year, that process doesn't happen. Or it does happen, but it was happening during COVID, during video calls, and we've already discussed how a lot of that was inaccessible, or parents were having to sit with their young person to help them manage the online classroom setting, or they weren't getting it, so like a different kind of change. But for some young people, it took away all their anxiety as well. So that at-home schooling situation, school is their safe space. It's expressed in the findings of the report to you that it is a young person's safe space, especially if they find school challenging, and people were worried that would then become the norm and they would lose all of the skills that they would need to engage with college or employment or training or further life opportunities, because they feel very comfy with their families, and they're not having to kind of stretch themselves a little bit or challenge themselves when it comes to things that they find anxiety provoking or that kind of end of school. So has that answered your question?
Thank you. It does. Thank you. I want to come to you, Ms Whitelock, just in relation to the breakdown of transition pathways, and you've explained to us, both of you already, the impact of that on the learners and a little bit about the impact on the families. But what was the result of that? What was the impact of that breakdown? Were people just left? Was there more pressure on parents and carers, for example?
Yeah, if some people disengaged, and I think further down our statement you'll see that we stepped up and tried to run befriending services for some people to see if that would kind of keep people engaged to then go back to learning. So some people did disengage, and I think some parents spent a lot of time trying to fight, ask for answers as well, and some people phoned the helpline quite worried about the fact they couldn't get answers, or that transition, as I mentioned, transition planning had started, it had been agreed and then had to change but they weren't sure how, or the new terms weren't suitable. How do they renegotiate? How do you recontract when the person is midway, when you're not quite one thing or another? I'm aware that some people, obviously when lockdown was there was no need for travel training, but in the space between school and let's say going to college, there can be a need for travel training. And so when you're ready to go back to in-person, how does that then get started at that later point? So some challenges around that. I need to look into it further, but for some people there were some interruptions to their qualification profiles, which of course is important going forward. So we are aware of some people accessing our adult services who don't have qualifications. They didn't finish them at school. And we were aware of some home learners, again, who didn't finish them at school and are now seeking to do it as an adult. So it breaks the momentum for people as well, and it takes quite a strong network to continue to move forward in that. But for some people, they maybe don't have that resilience at that point, and then you're sort of starting again. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
It does. In terms of the helpline you mentioned, did transitions, or particularly post-school transitions, feature heavily in the requests and the queries you got?
Yeah, they do anyway, actually. They do. It's a sort of impartial space for people to understand what's reasonable to ask. Where's the third? But we don't necessarily go into the rooms with people, but parents will phone up. And I noted that from asking my team, some parents are sort of outraged with the lack of provision. I mentioned that cliff edge at the start, so the lack of provision for the young person. It almost seems that the more support you need to learn, and perhaps the lower level of an academic, the level that you're learning at an academic level, the less support available, the less options for you to move on to. And so that was a problem before the pandemic, amplified through it, and it's still a problem.
Okay. I want just finally to ask you, Mr. Reid, about the divergent influencers you mentioned at the outset of your evidence. You've said it again in your Relate response, that they created podcasts and they publish a magazine called Quaranzine. The magazine contains artwork, poetry and prose that sets out their experiences during lockdown, and the inquiry has a note of that. I can quote from one contribution there. It says, "There has been a mixture of negatives and positives of living life during lockdown. Examples of negatives was being told I wouldn't be able to do the final exams, which was a major anticlimax. This would have been an opportunity to improve my final marks. I also felt really lost during lockdown due to my routine suddenly being changed. It had an impact on my mental health. I felt anxious going out and a risk of catching coronavirus." And there's not a particular mention there of transitions, but I wondered if you could summarise for us, Mr. Reid, if you feel able to speak on behalf of the divergent influencers, what they consider to be the impact the pandemic and the pandemic response had on their transitions.
They could probably tell you themselves, and it would be best coming from them, and I think they've spoken to some of your council already.
Yes, in relation, our Let's Be Heard project has been in touch with divergent influencers. So it may be that you feel able to offer something just now on their behalf, or it may be that you would rather leave that engagement to them.
I think they've been really anxious about it. Some of them are still not over the pandemic and the anxiety that brought with it. Some of them, when the pandemic was happening, were leaving post and food delivered in their vestibule room, because they could close the door between the outside and the inside for 3 days, because that was the advice that they were given, so they wouldn't catch COVID. And these are people with life-shortening conditions, and COVID would have been fatal. So you can understand that huge anxiety. Couple that with everything, and the mixed messages that they're receiving. The anxiety was running really high on the tail end of the pandemic. All of them feel, you would use the word gaslighted quite significantly by, okay, it's fine, to now go and do things, and they are hearing still about different strains of COVID. They're plugged into that news. So for them it's been very, very complicated and nerve-wracking. and also, I guess, on the other side of it, as a positive, it has made them realise, as Emma said, that a lot of them are fighting for accessibility within university classes, because some of them have gone to university and college, and flat no, we do not deliver classes online. Flat no, pandemic happens. Oh, do you know what? We've managed to suddenly provide everything that you are asking for because the majority of people now need it. And if anything, it's probably galvanized them more to question the decisions that are happening around disability and autism and accessibility and equality and inclusion and what that actually means for them. But yeah, they will be able to tell you themselves. And if you want to listen to the podcast, it's kind of clear, I think.
Thank you. We have the podcast and also copies of the quarantine, which I mentioned, which we will, of course, take into account, but that was helpful for you to set that out for us. Just in closing, I wanted to ask both of you if you consider there are key lessons that should be applied to address and perhaps mitigate some of the impacts you've spoken about there, some of the long-term and ongoing impacts, perhaps. I'll come to you first, Ms Whitelock.
Yeah, one of the challenges, I think, at lockdown was that everything had to happen so quickly and there wasn't time to involve people as fully as we might do. So perhaps a lesson learned is that whilst we all seek to involve people meaningfully in the service design and I guess in relation to transition pathways to make sure things are going well, the speed of change meant that didn't happen, and that meant that a lot of people were left frustrated, anxious, powerless really in that situation, and so it kind of goes against the grain of having person-centred transition pathways. So perhaps a lesson learned is to seek to try and make sure people have more of a say at that stage, and to recognise the impact that it's not just on one thing, but we mentioned at the start there's a whole scaffolding of things, and that some people it's more compounded, and to actually think how can we make sure that those people are receiving extra support. I mentioned a minute ago the more support you need, perhaps for some people the less options and support that's available. Some people it's a commitment that there'll be a post-school transition for people. It's not a complete guarantee, and we are aware of some people who actually do fall through the net and who don't move on to a post-school destination. So I think if we get it right for the group of people who are the most marginalised and most excluded and who have been hardest hit in this situation, then we're more likely to get it right for everybody. So I think we've mentioned some more lessons learned in this statement, but you know, at the heart of it, we had to revert back to the doing to people rather than working with people to some extent, and that was just, it's very frustrating for people. So I think it was quite negatively impactful and took us back the way, probably around people feeling valued and trusting the very agencies that people need to trust in order to move things forward. So I think we probably will see the ripples for a while to come. So yes, that probably wasn't very eloquent. Sorry, I can perhaps give a fuller answer afterwards. I'll hear your questions.
Yes, if you think that would be helpful to provide an answer to that particular closing question on key lessons, then please feel free to do that. But as you say, we've got some a note of them in your statement. But if that's something you want to do, by all means, that would be helpful.
Thank you.
Mr. Reid.
So many. I think there are lessons in how everybody responded to the pandemic, and I think one for me is the lack of agile systems. And I think if another pandemic comes around, how do all of the people involved in transitions become agile and respond? And it has clearly pointed out that the transitions happens within multiple different processes within bureaucracy and legislation and strategy and all of this stuff. And at the end of the day, it's just a young person wanting to do what they want to do with their life. And for young people, with disabled young people or autistic young people, it's infinitely more complex. And how do we have a system around that young person that's not only agile, but also gets them what they want to do and where they need to go to effectively. And that's where the pandemic really shone a light, where the friction kind of wore away these things that people rely on. But also there were lessons that we all learned about accessibility. And I just want to reflect on, we were able to make all university classes available online. And that is a huge thing for a lot of, not everyone's cup of tea, but granted, it's like the ways that we started to look and care for each other and recognise that there are vulnerable people in society that need support. Huge lessons there, I think. And COVID really shone a light on all of that. And we've stepped away from all of the rhetoric around that. We used to clap for people. I can't believe some of that stuff now. And now we know that their health and social care system are experiencing even more cuts and even more lack of funding. And transition is just one element of a huge health and social care service that is massively underfunded. And it's gone past... It's gone past efficiency savings and it's gone into real cuts. And if there was a pandemic next month, I think the response would be even worse than it was in 2020, 2019 because of what's been happening to health and social care services in Scotland since then. So the rest of the things are in the report in the Section 8. But
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you both. And my Lord, I have no more questions for the witnesses unless your Lordship has anything to ask or observe.
No, I've got nothing to ask, thank you very much, Ms Stewart, but I do have something to observe. And thank you both, I should say, before I say this. But turning to you, Mr Dean, can I thank you for your bravery, frankly, or your candour in saying towards the end of evidence, you'd be better, this is in relation to DIs, you'd be better let them tell yourselves, or go to the people that experience this. I'd like to reassure you that I actually agree with that sentiment, and it's been something that I've been thinking about quite hard as I've listened to evidence not only of you but of other people that have contributed to this particular sector of the inquiry. We have a very significant repository of statement and informations from people collected by Let's Be Heard, which I think you alluded to and have heard of, many thousands of such things, and including persons in the category that you mentioned. And I'm going to take particular care to ensure that in relation to DIs, we seek out some of that information. I'm sure the team that's doing this will be doing this in any event, but for the avoidance of any doubt, we're going to look at that very carefully so that we can reflect, not what you said second hand, and that is not a criticism of you at all, but so we can reflect what these people said themselves, and we get it very bluntly and very plainly. So I hope that's of some reassurance to you.
yeah, thank you.
Good. Right, with that, thank you both again, and that brings us to an end of today's proceedings. Thank you, Ms Stewart, and we're off until Tuesday, so hope everyone enjoys the weekend.
Thank you.